First, I apologize for the long title and the environmentalism, as well as the relatively biographical presentation. But the topic merited this, so it's work that I've been doing for a long period of time, and it just looks that way across my portfolio. So without any further ado, I'll get going. Next. So this talk reinforces the view that for safety in the production and operation of AI, a currently unheld level of understanding in both what models learn in their production and how models react to engagement will be required. Its goals aim to develop a conversation that ensures the intended effects arise from the deployment of AI into society, and that these effects are with the best interests of users in mind, and that AI's deployment entails as few side effects for users as possible. In part, this talk is an open response to Elon Musk and all of those who've recently signed the same letter urging big AI to pause giant AI experiments. I've been working on many problems related to these concerns, often through small-ish experiments, perhaps often from different perspectives and impetuses. For Elon and those others who are worried about these problems, I would tender an invite to discuss and to share more about what we're learning and how we have already learned from our work. So who am I and how do we get here? My undergraduate background's in physics. My graduate studies focused on both pure and applied mathematics. My focus is on scientific computation, dynamical and complex systems, measure theory, and abstract algebra. As a PhD student in 2011, I encountered language generation in relation to network growth models as a student of complex systems. At that time, my advisor's work was booming from early adoption of Twitter's data as research materials and the development of lexical approaches to sentiment analysis. So in other words, word frequency approaches to figuring out how happy or sad a document is in a reductive sense. In 2013, a fellow student who was assigned to an application analyzing the public sentiment on a possible e-cigarette ban within the EU had expressed frustration to me in a hallway conversation, noting the exceptional volume of social bots or automated accounts that were in Twitter's data. This seemed like a silly problem to me, since I knew that humans, and bots by complementation, were eminently predictable from their generative properties. So by developing software to coarsely estimate one single generative parameter, my colleague and I demonstrated that simplistic prediction, basically using one feature, was capable of strongly outperforming most bot detection systems at the time. But of course, that was 2013, and our work took until 2016 to be fully published. Is that okay? Okay. The bot problem on Twitter was real then, and for many generations in AI years after that. By the time I moved to Philly in summer 2016, my opportunity to start the coded lab in data science at Drexel coincided with the developing awareness for a need to resolve disinformation problems on platforms. This was before Cambridge Analytica, when Facebook's data was plentifully available for research. That was a time, believe it or not, much easier to access than Twitter's, and with no special API access. Coded was fortunate enough to obtain an important sample of data from Facebook in 2016. The collection spanned a hyperpartisan data set of social commentary, Facebook posts, discussing political news coverage during the 2016 election. These original posts constituted roughly 1 week's complete coverage of 9 news outlets, which were organized into 3 groups: left-leaning, mainstream, and right-leaning. We found Facebook to be rife with bots at a rate not unsimilar to that believed on Twitter, which was novel information at the time. And more importantly, we found clear signals between the abundance of bots and the polarization of outlets, namely, mainstream outlets exhibited much greater presence of automation, despite the presence of hyperpolarized conversations, by contrast, in the left and right-leaning outlets. Most importantly, despite transitioning from Twitter to Facebook, this study was easy to conduct because of the bot detection's method of generality. It depended on text alone. So what was this magic feature, which, if measured for a user, could so easily identify if they were a bot? Also, hasn't AI become more powerful than it was in 2016? So Now we digress. I was told a long time ago that you only get one equation per talk, so after this slide, I guess it's a failure. But I promise that it doesn't really matter too much what the equation means, other than the fact that there are parameters in this equation that are interesting. But if you want to think about this, it's the normal distribution of a vocabulary in a very coarse way. Throughout our work on bot detection, we have found that generative features are capable of easily providing potent information about the presence of human-generated text, hence bots. Generative features are regressed parameters used to fit a statistical model of a given user's vocabulary. As said, it's the normal distribution for a vocabulary. These can provide insight into how a user on a social media platform or any other author of text data is generating their language. Human authors are text generators. Our most refined model of the vocabulary, the mixing law depicted here, proposes a mathematical description for how arbitrary samples of language overlap in their use of tokens, so multiple documents, and that's what's being mixed. However, as bots become more human-like, these generative features likely will have diminished efficacy, in prediction that is. The key insight for bot detection is that humans are incredibly consistent, normal even, in their use of these statistics. For example, the most fundamental of these, the replication rate, which is given by theta there, quantifies the rate at which a generator utilizes previously uttered tokens. So will I use words that I've already used in this presentation? Very likely, and as the presentation continues, there will be momentum in the direction of my speech. However, it is the other quotient-based exponent in the mixing law, which you can see as having an n and an r and a quotient, in the mixing law that is the most potent. That feature, when measured, is the best for predicting bots. It describes the average drop in entropy or uncertainty, which is just the reciprocal of perplexity if you're a language generator, that a user exhibits with their vocabulary when considering the restriction of their whole vocabulary to the tokens expressed in just one document. So this is about how my vocabulary collapses once I enter into a single conversation. While humans tend to express very consistent portions of their vocabularies during text generation, bots tend to exhibit higher or lower variance in their vocabulary usage, likely dependent on how their architectures are defined and/or on how they are deployed. While the mixing law and its parameters that you can measure models the bulk of vocabulary usage across several generative features, so it's very succinct. Just a couple of parameters can predict bots well. Novelty is a signal that measures 1 minus the replication rate, as stated, that thing called theta in the previous slide. But it measures it in real time, so in other words, how quickly I stop issuing new words as I begin a conversation. How does that quantity drop off? This can be thought of as a time series and a very non-parametric or low assumption model. So if you wanted to think about the normal distribution of a vocabulary, that's out the window. We can just measure this for any sample of text and we just get a jagged line, but its features don't depend on specific words. They just depend on how many words you've spoken, so to speak. So it's a non-parametric, low-assumption generative signal that we can utilize for bot detection as well. This means that the novelty rate expresses the same, if not more refined modeling information as the mixing law, but with many more parameters than the mixing law. In other words, as many parameters as the size of the user's vocabulary. Nevertheless, novelty provides us with an extremely non-parametric capacity for text-only bot detection, which is critical in the case of detecting generated text in strange environments, for example, where text structure doesn't conform to normal vocabulary statistics. So you might wonder, how well do these features do by comparison to other tools which have been utilized for bot detection over the years? And I'll acknowledge that based in the last conversation, there are differences between bot detection and detecting generated text at the sentence level, which merit conversation too. As of 2021, the use of generative features for text-only bot detection performs similarly to the botometer system, which was released in 2020. So this was a standard of research for bot detection for many years. It's quite striking to see this because botometer utilized thousands of features for its detection prior to ceasing support when Twitter ended its free tier API service. Botometer no longer exists in that sense. Botometer was capable of detection through the use of text and multimodal features. These included network structure, platform-specific attributes, and other non-text features, while the mixing law parameters utilized only text-based features. These differences no doubt indicate that hybrid and even more multimodal systems could perform better. While multimodal featurization is best, bot detection in general should at core rely upon portable features that don't depend on platform-specific structures or on access to information that platforms can easily hide. While these can be utilized too, there's little hope in reliably offering users tools to defend themselves if their methods can be rendered useless by platform policies. So let's talk about what some other features are that one can look at on platforms to determine where volumes of automation exist. So you see the title here. Maybe you've had this idea before, back when you had access to Twitter. But research ideas like this are perhaps reductive and enticing, and they can be conveyed really easily, such as in a title line. But stated more methodologically, the question is, that I've seen several times before, can one track a Twitter user's follower count over time to observe their performance at a public event? It seems pretty reasonable. I've seen research I see. I've mentioned that already. The first few attempts that I encountered were simply stymied by the lack of availability of an API for historical values of metrics. And I want to make this crystal clear that there was never a way to retrieve a history of a user's follower counts. You could only ever access the follower count at a given time, and the same is the case for other metrics. So it's at an instant. So that's what we're left with. How do we come together with these charts? Well, we do a lot of data engineering in my lab because that's a big part of data science. You don't get to see things unless you build the data set. And Coded's operation ultimately led to one undergraduate student developing a terms-compliant program to recurrently access follows data, that is, time-stamped followers counts. But we noticed some anomalies in these user follow counts. Dramatic spikes and sawteeth, alluding to adjustment by automation, which, if true, could only be explained through two hypotheses, clearly not necessarily both at the same time. One, there was a data systems malfunction and or a systematic misrepresentation of the social metrics. For example, a database could asynchronously update and correct afterwards. Or droves of social bots circulating or rapidly following and unfollowing high-profile Twitter users could perhaps be targeting system metrics. Your ranking is affected by how many followers you have and the rate of accrual of those followers. It's big business. The really strange part was that these spikes and sawteeth were present throughout a user's data at a user-specific variance that was constant, as though it were being operated as an automated service in proportion to each user's relative base of followers, but not even always in the same direction. You can see in this picture that the spikes on Elon Musk's account are pointing down. Spikes on Donald Trump's account pointing up. What that means, we don't know. So how could we determine if the circulating accounts hypothesis was plausible, which is what we came to call it? First, we could directly measure circulations, believe it or not, as Twitter provided access to follower lists too. You could get user IDs. However, this posed numerous challenges with API bandwidth, leaving us only feasibly able to access the 10,000 most recent followers of each high-profile Twitter user repeatedly every second. With these 10,000 most recent follower lists, it was possible to stitch together the following order that a user had of their followers. And this was, of course, unless the users gained new followers extremely fast. And some of these users gained new followers extremely extremely quickly, so quickly that it would be impossible to measure. Within a stitched list, a user account appearing out of order on the list, that is repeatedly, must have unfollowed and then followed the high-profile user again. These were ground truth circulating accounts. As it turns out, circulating accounts existed, and this direct empirical measurement of them could be compared to estimations from the cumulative effects of spikes in saw teeth. In other words, we could correlate the two signals. Comparing circulations with spikes and saw teeth demonstrated two differently correlating regions in a concave down pattern. It's an upside down parabola-ish. The total spike and saw teeth effect increases beyond a critical point near 15 million posts. It's relatively arbitrary based on these restrictions that we've faced. And as mentioned, past that point, circulations become unmeasurable. So on the right of that line, you have users which accrue followers far too fast for us to be able to keep track of their full lists at 10,000 followers at a time, every second. So what's going on here? These two entirely separately measured effects are likely related, and the non-monotonic behavior is even interpretable. Accounts with high spike and saw effects on the right for them, capturing all circulations was impossible due to challenges in how rapidly their new followers bury the 10,000 most recent in the lists, as mentioned already. Accounts accruing fewer followers, though, would have their measurements biased from veracity in the order of following lists, and this was something that was acknowledged in the Twitter API's terms of service. So in other words, the order of followers would change depending on veracity in the database, and we would see more circulating accounts than expected in the low accrual regime. Regardless of the trend's nature, we would have been surprised that circulations existed at all, let alone in the volumes recovered and implied. You'll notice that's the line y equals x, and they cross. So literally, we measured the right number of circulations for a certain regime of the data. However, for the detection of social bots in mass, there's some open questions. Are circulating accounts bots? We can acknowledge certain aspects of the phenomenon in this table. So for example, the Governor Bill Weld account at the time had accounts that over a several month period, all of them in the circulating pool circulated approximately 20 times. So how many times does an account need to follow and unfollow another account? Is anybody doing this on their own, just for fun? And if so, why? Maybe you can answer that by asking a question afterwards. However, one last observation within these experiments challenged direct reporting. Circulating accounts were found deleted nearly as quickly as they were discovered to circulate. That is, by the time the final analysis was conducted, most accounts were gone. You might ask, how do accounts disappear from a platform so quickly and still the platform maintains the same number of average monthly followers or more? That's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer, but I have some thoughts. But we were exposed to other signals within the data that are worth reporting. And whether or not you can continue to access these sorts of signals is another question entirely, as hinted at several times. Continuing, we found that access to follower lists could elucidate other strange features. So for example, using API bandwidth to collect a deep or complete view of some most prolific users' follower lists. Since this is a really interesting phenomenon with the way Twitter was set up. Tweet IDs and user IDs are granted in order. So actually, user IDs are a more refined temporal quantity than the timestamps themselves at this point because of how fast Twitter is tweeting. With this in mind, it means that the number of digits that your account ID has says something about how old your account is. And we can look to see the volume, relatively speaking, of the length of account IDs within a follower list as a profile to measure strata of followers. In the graph, the inset figure exhibits a cohort of over 100,000 ancient user accounts. Why do I call them ancient? Because they don't have very many digits in them. The strange part about this, though, is where the graph reverses. To see such a group, hundreds of thousands of them from a particular period of time, follow accounts all at once, suggests something about community dynamics or potentially control of a network. What that is remains to be seen, but these are ways of seeing these phenomena. Note that these studies were performed and published during the height of the pandemic in 2020. Since then, Coded has received no contact from Twitter, neither confirming nor denying any interpretation. As of 2022, the sawteeth effects were no longer observed, maybe a corrected database. But the spike effects remained as present as ever. This means that the possibility of spike-related circulating account events persisted through the transition between Twitter's API upgrade from version 1 to version 2, which involved major upgrades. While this suggests that such features could be utilized to uncover active botnets today, these methods would be hindered by restrictions now present on Twitter's API, much like occurred with the other platforms previously. So what can we do? Before Twitter's ownership and policies on data changed, the bot problem showed no signs of slowing down. It could be observed from a variety of different angles, and a number of open avenues exist for the detection of large botnets, as well as individual bot accounts, especially for developers within the Twitter community who have access to data. However, social media platforms have legitimate uses for bots, and when these are utilized well, they are usually apparent to users. This is clearly going to become a much larger problem as generative AI moves into its next phase, now with OpenAI's ChatGPT and other releases, presumably something to do with the open letter. If the current generation of AI research does stumble into AGI, one issue it might be faced with is the dangerous inefficiency of its architectures. Current systems require huge quantities of data, compute, and time to train. If some self-replicating intelligent software interests itself in survival, wouldn't it find concern with its access and control of energy resources? In a sense, the open letter points to a statement made directly by OpenAI, acknowledging the inevitable need for the most advanced AI efforts to agree to limit the rate of growth of compute used for creating new models. Whether this or environmentalism is the open letters or OpenAI's concern, they ultimately isn't the ones that motivated our research on architecting efficient AI. We see our approach to the development of efficient AI as a pragmatic necessity for the sustainability of the industry, which can't ultimately be avoided. But if first entered this topic over research concerned with generative AI's hallucinations, so that's how we engage this topic for the first time. So let's talk about hallucinations for a second. Universal adversarial triggers. You might have seen these sorts of things in computer vision in the past, where there would be a little patch of swirly colors that you would use to confuse a computer vision detection algorithm and detect me as something like a microphone instead of a person. These exist for text too. Universal adversarial triggers induce undesirable output from modern generative text models and can be learned adversarially to induce specific responses. This not only means that developers can learn triggers to potentially harm the deployment of others' AIs, but likewise suggests that prompting users interacting with AIs could seemingly accidentally stumble into triggers, thereby destabilizing the AIs. Interestingly, there could be good and bad in this. I know that sounds strange. On the one hand, the bad, the current paradigm of AI is unstable and capable of wild behavior induced by users. On the other hand, these users could arm themselves with triggers. That is, using them to dox bots that they suspect are in their conversation. So if I were in a chat room, I were worried about speaking to ChatGPT, and I had learned a trigger for ChatGPT, I would issue the trigger and watch it explode. Regardless, mitigation of these problems is an important and active area of research. However, given the nature of mitigation systems, performance is commonly blunted and systems become less efficient than ever. So why do generative AI hallucinate? That's not a question people usually try and answer. One of the perhaps unexpected developments within the deep NLP community occurred around 2010, with the advent of research performed at Google on the subject of word representation. At the beginning of every neural network or deep learning algorithm, we have to take our data and turn it into some kind of a numerical representation, a vector. And that's what this was in 2010. At that time, the newly developed word-to-vec algorithm was found to produce low-dimensional word vectors, representations of tokens. These not only were useful for transfer learning, but were also found to contain a striking volume of analogical information. That is, word vectors naturally knew analogies through addition and subtraction. You could subtract and add certain combinations of vectors, and you can predict what the missing part of the analogy was. These analogical behaviors were observed throughout the word vector developments and persisted as a point of marvel and evaluation for the years and into more modern, context-dependent representations now called transformers. It was at this point, in 2019, that our work encoded mathematically analyzed the range of early word vector algorithms and uncovered that the analogy property was likely based in data and not model architecture, and that gradient descent wasn't even needed to train the word-to-vec algorithm, as we had found a closed-form solution to an optimizing set of its parameters. We'll discuss this more shortly. When you start asking why, you start learning a little bit more about how. And at the time when we were concerned about triggers, it was apparent that they were due to data. You could trigger something that you saw during training. This is not to say the exact same thing that you saw during training. You would hallucinate something that would mingle the generations of text that you had seen during training. So, with that in mind, the idea was, could we use the analogy properties that we had learned about to determine when a data set respected a certain set of analogies? That is to say, could we find more of the right data for our language model that we want to train, rather than all the data, as is currently done? So data sets of analogies can cover arbitrary topics, whether you realize this or not. The relevant analogy category here is a strange one, so I'll say it several times. It's UK, cities, and counties. But moreover, they can be organized specifically to characterize speech communities if you want them to. They don't just have to cover strange geographic or grammatical relations. But thinking about it another way, we could ask, does every data set optimally represent some underlying structure of analogies? And that's more true than you might realize. In this picture, a data set of analogies called the bigger analogy test set is used to evaluate how different analogies interact with two data sets. One data set is all of Google Books. I don't have all of Google Books, but I can download their word frequencies from Google Books, because that's all I need. And the other data set is a sample of a few hundred Wikipedia pages that we collected from links pointing to each of the pages for the official UK, cities, and counties. In other words, we biased a sample that we knew would know an extreme amount of information about one analogical category. Exactly one analogical category, but maybe you get other stuff with it. Notably, this is obscure, this category, and when we think about how large Google Books is, the fact that a few hundred Wikipedia pages can be discovered, so to speak, by comparison to Google Books is the power of this method. In other words, analogical bias detection. It will help us form data sets that can be used to restrict the training data of a language model to just the way we want it to speak. But that's something that we could do in the future, not a capability that we have now. This is really just proof of concept. So, in principle, our method could be used to sample data strictly covering an obscure topic, which could provide an efficient approach to data engineering for low-resource text generation. This is biographical, though. This is how we got into the subject of text generation, being concerned about triggers. And this mode of affecting the bias in AI is not one that, shall we say, is normative or particularly welcome, considering that it says change your training data. Your model is the problem. It's been trained over the wrong data. So our work on the analogy property in word vectors and on developing sampling bias technology was additionally accompanied by several other results, and I'll go through a few of these other results. It was accompanied by a warm start procedure for the glove algorithm, which is a word representation algorithm that gets you word vectors. But the way that we had done this warm start procedure was by a model of the glove algorithm's parameters based on independent word frequency assumptions. Assuming word order doesn't matter for any analysis, it's a tough sell, quite frankly, when you try and say word order doesn't matter for a particular purpose. So it's hard to get this sort of thing through peer review depending on the community that you submit it to. And being inside of a computing college, there's pressure to make sure this research sees the light of day in standard normative conferences. And so those are the places where many of these reviews came from. But the big benefit of assuming that word order doesn't matter is that we could define a model which required absolutely no data for pre-training. And that was remarkable, and reviewers did remark upon that as being surprising, despite their lack of interest in publishing these results. So amid criticism, without mathematical invalidation, there was not a single criticism which disputed the mathematics. We dug in and proved several propositions during the NeurIPS review process. The first proposition that we proved is that word order is generally far closer to independent than dependent. And that might seem strange, but by numbers, it's far more independent than dependent. Second thing we proved was that a similar analogy property, and hence sampling bias strategy, existed for both the softmax and negative sampling versions of the word-to-vec algorithm, which also covers the fast text algorithm. This was important because some of the concerns were about our focus on just one algorithm, but this covers the entire family of that generation of representation learning algorithms. And the third result that we proved, as a means of showing this, was explicit forms for the values of a solution to the original version of the word-to-vec algorithm. Not contrastive learning, not negative sampling, the softmax version. It took some time for the potential impact of this third result to become clear, far beyond the obvious potential of the idea of learning word embeddings from data without the use of gradient descent or backpropagation. We had been focused on publishing entirely different results and still weren't accepted for publication at NeurIPS by the time we had proven all of these propositions. Following this, and an almost entirely numb response from a different community, the ACL, there were no criticisms with the math or of the actual coherence of the work or the quality of the writing, simply that it graded with the current methods, and if you can't show that your models perform objectively better than the state of the art, we're not interested. So in other words, compare your work to large language models, which is kind of ridiculous. But we'll get to that a little bit more shortly. There were no specific criticisms about any of the derived results, and the criticisms were mainly about the lack of impact and the fact that it was based in theory and about older algorithms, glove, word-to-vec, during the transformer revolution. There was a lot of bias in what is publishable at this point. So we built. At first glance, our solution to the softmax activated word-to-vec algorithm seemed like it was teaching us something infuriatingly uninteresting. that a word-to-vec model factorizes the conditional probability matrix of a co-occurrence distribution. If you've ever learned about conditional probability, this is basically just saying you learned enough in high school. Now you can go do a single-layer neural network. It didn't even tell us the factors, though. So it didn't necessarily give us the word vectors themselves. It gave us access to the overarching model. But if we wanted those word vectors, it seemed like we were stuck. We'd have to do more eigenvector decompositions, like the no data word representation we had built before, and I guess that wasn't impressive enough. But in time, we discovered that the softmax solution's skipgram parameters could be used to define a generative model. While we knew that the CBOW version of the original word-to-vec algorithm was defined as a generative model, it was surprising to see that skipgram could define a generative model too. However, for skipgram to become a generative model, a prior was needed. I'll pause at this point to note that the CBOW version of the word-to-vec algorithm can be thought of as the simplest form of where you start if you want to start thinking about how to derive a transformer. So these are in the same family of algorithms, and they are the natural starting point, despite them being a previous generation back. But proving something about them, and then continuing to prove other things about the more complex and modern family of algorithms that descend from them, will be in our future. While we had previously regarded the CBOW variant as retaining the most salient architectural features of transformers, it was the skipgram variant whose parameters could actually be solved explicitly. So this is good that skipgram has a higher likelihood from training data than CBOW because we can actually write down the parameters. But how would the two actually compare? How would we prove something like this? That was another step that we had to take in order to even be able to enter this space. And it took another year of software and mathematical development to determine this relationship between skipgram and CBOW as generative models. What we found was well aligned to numerous observations made empirically from the literature. In other words, word vectors usually come out with skipgram being a better implementation than CBOW if you're using them the way they were invented to be used. Again, reviewers weren't happy, but held no technical criticisms, even suggesting that such work could not be published without experiments showing that a proven probability theoretic result held up in data. In other words, the reviewers didn't believe in math, despite being unable to prove it wrong. But that aside, the predictions of these generative models may not only resemble the quality of neural models, they are generative neural models. Moreover, we actually know what they're learning. In other words, they're fully interpretable. So as mentioned, we continued to build because demonstration was necessary to convince people who didn't necessarily believe in the math. And the pattern wasn't difficult to see. Peer reviewers were rankled by gradient-free optimization, or in other words, solved parameters. And generally, they weren't interested in understanding why the underlying models behind the previous generation of AI worked, despite the clear needs in AI now for interpretability. So, we developed software based on the skipgram generative model for a tool capable of training foundation models efficiently, using no gradient descent or backpropagation. In other words, showing that the math works. We also demonstrated the engineering power of understanding why certain architectural aspects of deep neural networks, including those within transformers, are useful. In other words, showing that we can build neural systems in much less ad hoc and more interpretable ways. Ultimately, what resulted from this endeavor was a framework that can be utilized to scale neural training over CPUs, not GPUs, for minimal time and cost, but then still be applied over a GPU to maximize speed of prediction. Building out a transformer-like architecture wasn't necessarily simple from the optimization method that we had derived. The optimization method could be applied to optimize the values of a single neural layer, and multi-layer models were an open question. In other words, we only had shallow neural networks and not deep neural networks. Likewise, since transfer learning is a main paradigm by which generative models are now used, we likewise needed to address questions over whether the generative pre-training statistics in these models could be transferred to other tasks, such as part of speech tagging or to segmentation. Much more work was needed, and most of all, to make these forms of optimization feasible, we needed dimensionality reduction. In other words, going from vectors the size of a whole vocabulary, which can be too big, to something tractable for a GPU. However, standard deep learning systems accomplish reduction as an intrinsic part of their optimization processes, in other words, during backpropagation. So we also had to develop an explicit algorithm for dimensionality reduction. Again, these were side effects of the main intent, which was focused on the principle that foundation models could be learned from less data at much less cost and with architectural components that strongly support model interpretation. Ultimately, we found that the skip-gram language model performed surprisingly well. And moreover, that pre-training and transfer applications were entirely feasible. The theory held up about predicting things that weren't the next token from token prediction statistics. The outlook is that locally optimized multi-layer models could likewise improve the overall performance of systems. However, these were all prototyped experiments, and each algorithmic component we developed ultimately needs much more research and development. The language modeling system that we released ultimately went under the name of It's a Machine and Natural, or I'm an LM. It was paired to our previously developed, though unreleased, universal tokenizer called Harmonically Regularized Byte Pair Encoding, or HRBPE. In truth, opening HRBPE was just as big of a software and information release as IMIN was, since HRBPE was actually an application of the mixing law too, used to regularize an extremely fast implementation of the byte pair encoding algorithm, but by far more advanced for utilizing fast distributional regularization and a generalization from merges to merges and splits as a paradigm for tokenization. If all of this sounds like jargon, just remember that HRBPE is capable of training good word tokenizers for any language, and that IMIN is capable of training generative language models and using their statistics for sequence tagging on your laptop. These software libraries are freely accessible prototypes that have mainly been developed for experimentation and demonstration. In other words, we're not at the point of pip install yet, but we're not far away. The IMIN release was an important step in demonstrating the capability of our approach. However, the much bigger picture at stake is the relevance of these methods more broadly to deep learning. The models we've produced are based on locally optimized shallow neural networks, some of which have been chained together with attention mechanisms to reasonably promising effect. In none of these approaches have we yet implemented a truly deep model, which would require more compositional optimization, having at least 2 layers of a neural network. However, we've already begun the deep mathematical analysis, the extension of the word-to-vec analysis, to 2-layer generative models, and in that theoretical experiment, we've already found surprising results about the explicit nature of hidden state parameters. So we know what is learned at a hidden layer too, and there's more work to be done to actually solve for these parameters. However, this is a subject that needs far more time and scrutiny to be studied properly, and many of our other preliminary results still need to be fully published first. This said, we have also begun experimenting with a version 2 framework of the IMIN system, which is general to deep learning applications. It's not hardwired to NLP. It can be used to modularly construct architectures for different tasks. For example, sequence-to-sequence machine translation tasks or digit classification, MNIST. Ultimately, the speed of our movement through these developments will be tempered by the interests in adoption of and collaborations over this research that develops. That's all I have, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.